Welcome back to the Excellent Leadership Podcast. Chad Biagini here, host and president of Excel Surgeon Advisory, joined with extraordinary guest Paul Barber, Chief Executive Officer and Vice Chairman of Brighton and Hove Albion. Paul's career is a masterclass in leadership, strategy, and cultural transformation. From his early days in public relations to key executive roles at the Football Association, Tottenham Hotspur, and the Vancouver Whitecaps, Paul has shaped the modern sports business landscape across both Europe and North America. Under his leadership, Brighton and Hove Albion have become a model of sustainable success, consistently outperforming its market size and budget in one of the most competitive sports leagues in the world. He has led the club's rise in the Premier League, championed data-driven recruitment, and built a strong organizational culture that sets Brighton apart. Today, we'll dive into Paul's leadership, how he's built a high-performing environment, and the strategic decisions that have helped Brighton and Hove thrive at the highest level in English football. Paul, welcome to the show. Hi, I'm Chad Biagini, host of the Excellent Leadership Podcast, joined today with Paul Barber, CEO and Vice Chairman of Brighton and Hove Albion. Paul, thank you for joining the show.
Thank you very much for having me.
So you've had a fascinating career, beginning in PR.
Yep.
You spent time at the Football Association. You spent time at Tottenham Hotspur. You moved over to Vancouver with the Whitecaps for a while. You've been leading Brighton and Hove Albion for a while. I'm going to start with a couple of fun questions for you. What's the weirdest thing a coach or a player has ever asked for in a negotiation?
It's funny, actually. I was on a conference panel a few weeks ago with Darren Bent, who is a very well-known striker who played for Tottenham, Sunderland, Aston Villa, Charlton, Ipswich, England. And normally when you're signing a player, the family will want either a private suite or a box. They want the best seats in the house. And Darren and I were talking about his father, who actually didn't want any of that. He wanted, first of all, a seat that was in line with the penalty area, side on, for basically being able to maintain eye contact with Darren during a game. And of course, the problem is those sort of seats are the seats that are usually season ticket holder seats. They've been held by that season ticket holder for years and years and years. And Darren's dad wanted the seat at a particular level, a particular point. And worse than that, he also wanted the opposite seat on the other side of the ground so that he had, for each half of the match, an ability to connect with his son on the pitch. And that's probably the strangest request that I've ever had, and also the most difficult to fulfill.
For sure. You're going to one of your season ticket holders and saying, hey, bad news.
Yeah, exactly that. And this was something that I'd never come across in my years in football, and still haven't to this day.
Yeah, I don't think I've ever heard that one before. And I'm going to give you another question, kind of similar lines. What's the most ridiculous transfer rumor you've heard about one of your players over the years?
Well, I guess the ones where they come in really late at the end of a transfer window, where you've got absolutely no chance to replace the player, even if you were to accept the crazy offer that might have come in. So I don't want to name names, but there's been a few of those over the years where, something's emerged literally on the last day of the window, which would no doubt benefit the club that made the offer, but would leave us considerably weaker and with no opportunity to fill that gap. Those ones always sort of make me shake my head, because I always sort of say to the club that makes that offer, what would you do if you were me, and how would you react to that kind of offer at that time? And that happens from time to time, opportunistically. But yeah, over the years, there's been a few of those.
Do you think it's usually a genuine transfer negotiation, or do you think certainly it's more gamesmanship for the next round?
I think certainly on occasions it has been. On other occasions, it's been more testing the water, just seeing if there's any kind of chink in your armor of saying no. And occasionally it's been about unsettling the player ready for the next window. But yeah, those ones are always a bit strange, I think, because I always think, well, if it was me making that offer to you at this time, what do you think your reaction would be? And usually it would be the same as mine, which is absolutely not.
Yeah. So you started your career in PR.
Yeah.
How did that prepare you for a career in football?
Well, I think one of the most important parts of this job is the communication aspect of it, whether that's internal communication, whether that's communication with external stakeholders, media, government, local authorities, wider football community, wider sports community, the public generally. And I think having a background in communications, understanding how the media works, understanding how to use written and verbal communication to persuade, convince, articulate complex messages has been valuable. And I wouldn't say that, that I started in the communications industry with a view to becoming a chief executive of a Premier League club, but it's certainly been really handy to have those skills over the years, and they've been more useful to me than not on many, many occasions.
I'm often asked, what should I do to develop my career farther? I think communication skills, learning how to speak eloquently, look at me breaking on the word eloquently, knowing how to write effectively is so important and undervalued. And for a long time, you had many chief executives who grew up through finance or grew up through operations. I'm not saying those aren't invaluable, but at some point, the weight of your words are critically important.
I think there was a shift probably around the turn of this century where the traditional career routes for chief executive officers of legal, of finance, of operations, of manufacturing shifted to communications and marketing disciplines, partly because big companies, even those in less sexy sectors, shall we say, realized that brand was important, valuable on the balance sheet, as well as in terms of winning business and driving growth. But the communication aspects of the marketing disciplines, if you like, were going to be critical in the 2000s for chief executive officers to be able to articulate their company's message. And if you had come from that background, then you were going to be probably on shortlists more often in the 2000s than you would have been prior to that, just simply because of the way the world was changing. And digital media accelerated that. I think the sort of democratization, if you like, of media changed that. Everyone became a content producer. Everyone became a commentator. Everyone became a spokesperson against or for brands on social media, particularly. And I think, therefore, having chief executives that were competent and confident to articulate their company's message and be prepared to be out there and be seen and be heard was quite a big shift.
What advice would you have for someone who maybe hasn't built that muscle today to prepare them for that future moment?
Build it and expose yourself. If it's not your comfort zone, then at the very least, you've got to get comfortable. If it is your comfort zone, then become as competent as you can, because I don't think it's going to change back. I don't think we're going to see a time where chief executives or chair people of companies are going to be back in the shadows. I think we're now expected to be at the forefront of our organization's message, and we're expected to deliver it personally. And I think the other challenge now for organizations is that one voice isn't enough. I think, organizations now becoming increasingly complex, certainly in the sports industry. It's not just about the chief executive speaking. It's about the coach, obviously, having a front and center role, the captain, and senior executives within the organization as well, who have specialist skill sets that from time to time they're also going to need to pick up the baton and to speak competently and confidently.
When we're doing CEO searches, it's often a conversation I'll have with the owner of saying, who do you expect to be that voice?
Yeah.
Because there's not always room for both voices in media either. And you have some owners who thrive in that or want that. And you've got others who have no interest in being the front face.
Yeah.
And that needs to be determined before a chief executive is hired.
It's really important because I think the public, particularly in a sports organization, the fans need to understand that if the chief executive is speaking, that he's speaking with the owner's authority and therefore he's speaking with the owner's voice. If it's the owner speaking, that's different, clearly. But it's very important that the strategy for the organization is worked out in advance. And also, I think it takes time. Certainly in my head, when I'm speaking, I can hear my owner's voice, or he's thinking in my own head, which enables me to articulate his thinking using my words and my voice. And I think that's important, because when he speaks, the way he says things, the way he delivers things may be different, but the message will be the same. And I think that's really important, that the consistency of message, particularly in sports organizations where it's fast moving, performance and results ebb and flow. You have good days, good weeks, bad days, bad weeks, but the consistency of message is really important regardless. And I think between owner and chief executive, working out who is the main voice from the non-playing side, from the non-technical side of the club, is really important. And then, of course, making sure the coach is well prepared to face the media, as they do now, multiple times a week, particularly if there are multiple games in a week. That's a big challenge, and it's sometimes hard, particularly in a bad run, particularly after a difficult day when the cameras are suddenly on you as a coach and you've got to start talking and making sure that you're on message. It's a challenge for every sports organization in the world, I think.
For a chief executive to be successful, being in lockstep with an owner is critical. How do you build that when you're new into a CEO job, that relationship and that trust with an owner, but beyond that, starting to think like that owner?
Yeah, I think it starts before you sign the contract, to be honest. I think understanding whether this is someone you can work with, someone who has shared values with you, someone who has the same ambition as you. And I think it's important for any chief executive going into an owner-led organization in the sports sector to get into the head of that owner as early as possible, and definitely before signing the contract. Because if you are on different paths to the way you want the organization run, the vision you have for its future, what you determine to be success factors, what actually success looks like, you're almost setting yourself up for failure from the start. I think the more aligned you can be from that moment, the better. And then once the contract is signed, I think it's then about spending time together and making sure that the chemistry that you establish during that process of recruitment is maintained and developed and harnessed and built on over time. And the more that happens, the more then you can get that voice and that ambition of the owner into your head, and it becomes something then that's part of you as well. Because if it's shared from the start, it's easy. If it's different from the start, it's much harder.
I found often experienced CEOs do a better job of interviewing the owner than perhaps a first-time CEO does in the process. I constantly have to guide up-and-comers. Don't just take the first CEO job you're offered, because often that person won't have a second chance at a CEO job if it doesn't go swimmingly.
I think that's absolutely right. And, certainly quite a few years ago now, probably 20 years ago, David Dean, who was the vice chairman of Arsenal Football Club and vice chairman of the Football Association, said to me very wisely, when you're considering jobs in club football, pick your owner, not your club. And I think, that advice has stayed with me over many years and has proved to be wise advice.
So what books, upbringing, values shaped who you are as a leader?
I think more than books or people, it's been mistakes along the way, to be honest. Personal mistakes along the way. Yeah, I love to read books about people, books about leaders. I like a lot of biographies and documentaries about great leaders. But I think, the best learning of leadership is yourself. And, over the years, I've kind of observed people that have managed me and have led me and have led organizations I've worked for. And I've said, well, I really like that. I really don't like that. If I'm ever in a leadership position, I'm going to do that and not that, or I'm going to behave like that and not that. And then I've tried things over the years, and some have worked and some haven't. And you then refine what has worked to try and make it better, and you change what hasn't worked to make sure you don't make that same mistake again. And I think over a period of time, you develop your own style and you're comfortable with that style. It's not necessarily a copy of somebody else's, and it's not necessarily something that somebody else could easily follow. It's just your own unique way of doing things. And, hopefully that leads you to a successful leadership career. If it doesn't, then again, you need to keep tweaking and refining and getting better. And even now, I still question myself after certain decisions, after certain processes, after certain appointments or hires, or certain ways I've handled different situations, and question whether I've got them right. And sometimes that can keep me awake at night, even now. But I think that's a good thing, not a bad thing, because I think if you're constantly looking to be better, and people around you see that there's a degree of humility, when you get it wrong, you say so. If you don't handle things as well as you'd hoped, you accept that or look for a bit of feedback, then people are more likely to trust you and follow you into the future. Whereas if you think that you're always right, then I think, you start to create a distance and a barrier between, the people you're trying to lead and their ability to follow you.
So you said you, as a leader, shape yourself and grow and become refined from mistakes. Are there any mistakes that you look back on that you say that moment helped change me as a leader for the good? Are there any that were milestones in your memory?
This is a one-off podcast, right?
Yeah.
I need a series. I think
get you back a few more weeks.
I think, to be honest, most of my mistakes over the years have been people related, as in, I'm a people person. I like to trust people to be the best they can be. I don't like to make quick decisions on people. I'm more likely to give people more time than perhaps I should on occasions to be the best they can be. And I suppose the lesson from a lot of that is that, you sometimes have to take tough decisions early. And if you're in a people business, and we are in a people business in sport, then invariably those early tough decisions are going to be people focused, people related. And that's against my sort of natural being, if you like. So I find that hard. And I've had to work harder at being tougher in those moments. If someone's not quite right, whether it's competence or culture, it could be personality fit with the team, it could be performance, ultimately, will always come into play, then you can support and you can encourage and you can help and you can assist, but there comes a point where you have to say this isn't working and we have to draw a line for both sides. And if you're a people person in a people-led organization, that's quite difficult, particularly in an organization like ours where our culture, our values are very important to us. And, we don't like to be ruthless off the pitch. We don't like to be hard on people when there's an opportunity to perhaps help or support them in a different way. So those natural instincts of mine, combined with the club's own culture, make those tough early people decisions very difficult.
Because most leaders have alarm bells going off in the first 30 to 60 days about, hey, maybe this just isn't the right fit for each other. What is that balance of patience, maybe we onboarded this person wrong, versus I just need to make a decision and start all over again?
Well, I think that's a really important point. I think the first checkpoint is, did we get this right? Either our process, our decision to hire, our onboarding. So the first reflection is this way, not that way. I think we all have a responsibility when we hire to ensure that our hire is a success. Yes, there's obviously a huge responsibility on the person who's been hired to be a success and to work at being a success. But the first job starts with us. And so that initial reflection, and I've been through this in the last couple of years, that initial reflection of, wow, did we get the process right? Did we make the right hiring choice? Have we done enough to give this person the best chance, best foundation of success? And if all of those things are yeses, then it is about the person you've hired and what they're doing to make their new job a success. And even at that point, we're still looking to support, we're still looking to encourage, we're still looking to build confidence, we're still looking to inspire that person to be the best that they can be. But yeah, usually I think within 60 days, you're starting to realize whether you've made a good hire or a not so good hire. And if it's the latter, then it's a question of, is there more you can do, or do you simply need to, cut your losses at that point for both sides? Because I think everyone at some point in their career will have a blip on their CV. They'll make the wrong decision to go to a particular place. You'll make the wrong decision to have hired someone, and that's okay. I'm more concerned when people don't realize that it's just a blip on their CV. It doesn't have to be career defining just because you've made one wrong career decision. But it does need to be recognized. And, I always find the people that sit across the table from me and say, look, you know what, that short period in my CV there was because I made a bad decision, and probably with hindsight, so did the organization. But we sat down, we realized that we both made a mistake for whatever reason that was, and we parted company quickly. And I've been able now to get on with my career and move on positively. I'm really refreshed by those sort of honest conversations because A, they're real, B, it avoids that, hang on, there's a bit of a gap in your CV here. What happened? You know, where were you for those 9 months? Well, actually, I was there, but I don't put it on my CV because it was such a disaster. Well, why was it a disaster? Tell me. So I'm much more comfortable with people that just own that, because most of us have got one.
Yeah, for sure. I've had clients I've worked with over the years where they sometimes take a lot of the hiring power away from the hiring manager, saying that person's going to be the most biased toward what they need and the most under pressure to what they need. And so they have other departments lead hiring, probably a bit similar to how a sporting director supports a coach in many situations.
Sure.
Like, I'm going to run this process. Your voice is going to be heard in this process, but you need a striker now. And that might not be the best decision for the organization over 3 to 5 years. And just taking some of that pressure off the individual can sometimes mitigate some of those hiring needs, as long as those other people take their job seriously.
Absolutely.
So Brighton has a very distinct culture. You guys have been intentional about building it. Talk about the culture of Brighton. What's it like to be an employee, to be an athlete there?
Well, first of all, it starts at the top. The chairman and owner, Tony Bloom, had and still has a very clear vision for what he wants the football club to achieve and the way he wants it to achieve its successes. So that we have a very clear vision, which we communicate consistently, externally and internally.
Say it out loud for me.
It's to be a top 10 Premier League club and a top 4 Women's Super League club. So every season, our staff know that our basic intention is to be top 10, top 4. That doesn't mean to say we don't want to be first or second, or we don't want to win a trophy. But what it means is, as our base vision, we know where we're trying to get to. And everything we do in terms of building infrastructure, hiring people, setting objectives, at the minimum is designed to support that very clear vision. We then have very clear and well-defined values that we articulate to all staff and to newcomers in particular. That's about aiming high. It's about treating people well, exceeding expectations, acting with integrity, and making things special. You know, those 5 values are not rocket science. You know, most organizations could adopt them, but we look for those behaviors, those ambitions in every single person, every single day. And very often it's those values that are guiding our decisions on whether someone stays with us and develops with us or doesn't stay with us. And very often when we do have those difficult conversations, when we're sitting across from someone who is going to be leaving, very often it's them saying, I know why I'm sitting here, because I haven't treated people well enough, or I haven't aimed high enough, or I just don't go about my job in a way that makes it special every day. And therefore their own self-reflection on why they're in that situation is values-based. And I think that's what helps determine the strength of our culture, is that people know what we're about, they know what we expect, they know what their part in that is. And we can forgive occasional dips in performance because people have difficult situations going on in their lives, or they've been unwell, and you know, performance can vary. And we have a high performance culture, but we know that maintaining high performance is actually very, very challenging. So you're always going to have moments when either individuals or teams or departments dip. But what you can do is you can actually support those people to restore that high performance level quickly if you're constantly in touch with them through the values. And that's how we run the organization.
So being in touch with them through the values, how is that lived out in performance reviews or day-to-day communication with team members?
Well, I think first of all, the most important thing is not to wait 12 months for that performance review, because if someone is falling behind in terms of their output or your expectations of them, to wait 12 months is too late. So you've got to be in touch with your staff, your departments, every single day, whether that's formally or informally. Sitting on the side of a desk and asking someone how their day's going is, in my opinion, as good as a performance review. because you can find out so much from that 1, 3, 4 minute conversation. Standing in front of people as opposed to communicating by email is another great way of getting the temperature of the organization. How is it feeling? How is it looking? What's people's body language like? What sort of questions are you getting at the end of that town hall, as we would call them? Are those questions showing that everyone in the room are fully engaged in what you're trying to achieve? And are there questions that are constantly coming back that are effectively saying to you, look, that may be the vision and that may be where we're aiming for, but there's a number of barriers here that you're missing. And we're now letting you know what those barriers are. So I think a combination of sitting on the side of a desk, standing up in front of people, whether it's by department or sometimes, in our case, a few times a year collectively, where the whole organization is in the same room, on top of those more formal reviews where people get a chance in a one-to-one situation to review their objectives against your expectations of how they're doing. All those things are important, and we try and use all of those different techniques to get to the right outcomes.
Quick interruption. If you are enjoying the Excellent Leadership Podcast, I have a small favor to ask you. Could you please take a moment to like, subscribe, and leave a 5-star review? It helps us grow the Excellent Leadership Podcast community and ensures we keep bringing you top-tier guests, powerful insights, and impactful episodes. Thanks for your support. Now, back to the show. How do you maximize that hiring opportunity to make sure somebody fits your values? Because interviews are not a perfect indicator of what someone's going to be like to work with.
No, they're not. And some people are the best salespeople in the world in an interview situation, and some people are the worst. So you've got to try and pick through what version of that person you're getting. Are you getting the best version of them because they're really good at selling? Or are you getting the worst version of them because they're not very good at selling?
Yeah, sometimes the best person for the job is the worst at the interviewing.
It's a bit, I was terrible at exams. I would much rather be judged every day over a year than for 3 hours in an examination once a year, because that just wasn't my way of showing that I was competent at a particular subject at school. And I feel for a lot of kids that get judged on just a set of exam results where those conditions may not suit their personality or the way they learn or the way they show how much they've learned. So in an interview situation, we try and sort of de-risk it by giving them a chance not just to answer questions, but maybe present. Or rather than have 2 or 3 people sitting across the table from them, why don't we actually put their 5 or 6 different people in a one-to-one situation with them in different parts of the organization? There might be a more formal interview in one room, but a much more casual, relaxed coffee in another. Or there might be a walk around the training pitch just to chat to them generally and get to know them on a one-to-one basis in a totally non-interview situation. And you can pick up on a lot of the signals as to whether that person's going to fit the values from those non-formal, non-set piece interview type moments. And then you build a picture, talk to people they've worked with, other organizations they've been in, try and talk to people wider across the industry about what they're like to interact with and to actually engage with, and build up as big a picture as you can, rather than relying on a 90-minute set piece interview, which I think, again, for me is quite a dangerous way of hiring people when you're in a people business. Sounds odd, but actually, you need to find out as much as you can and get to know that person as best you can in a variety of different situations.
I found sometimes the most valuable time is just calling somebody on a Friday and saying, hey, no updates, no decision has been made yet, but just wanted to check in. Hey, by the way, what are you up to this weekend? Yeah. And just getting to know someone in short 3 to 5 minute bursts, you start to really unlock who an individual is. Because to your point, the presentation formally in the boardroom, that does matter. But also just who are they as an individual, and how do they engage more casually, or how do they treat the person at the restaurant? All those pieces add to the puzzle when you're making a final decision.
And it's the same with players. I mean, we obviously look at their technical attributes as a major priority. They're elite athletes, and we need to ensure that the competencies and the capabilities they have fit the specification that the coach has requested. But we're also interested in their personality and their character. And that's not going to come through statistics or data. We're a very data-driven organization when it comes to recruitment, but we also need to make sure that we understand the person we're bringing into the locker room. Are they going to blend and gel with the group that's there? Are they going to be the sort of person that pushes standards even higher, or are they going to dilute the standards we've got? Are they the sort of person that when training is finished, that they're going to go home and rest and follow the coaches and all of the sports performance experts' instructions, or are they just going to do their own thing, waste energy or eat the wrong things? So the character reviews, need to be as detailed sometimes as the technical assessments. And you can only really get those by hard work, phoning around, talking around, building up as big a picture as you can, so that you really have a complete view of the athlete that in our case are buying. It's not just a case of hiring, we're buying. We're spending transfer funds in order to bring that player into our club. And it's men and women. It's not, it's not driven towards the male athletes. We need to find out as much as we can about the female athletes as well. And so as big a picture as you can build, whether it's an athlete you're buying, bringing into the organization, or a non-athlete that you're bringing into the organization, the more information you have, the more chance you've got of getting it right.
I'm going to come back to that in a second, but as you were talking, it made me wonder, how is that different for an academy athlete? How much are you interviewing the child, the kid, the young man, young woman versus the parents to know whether that's somebody? Well,
I think first of all, with the academy athletes, your responsibility is to shape them as people as well as athletes. So you are helping the parents and their teachers at their school to create a good human being. And the standards that we set in our academy on and off the field should be complementary to the way the parents are bringing the child up, to the way the school is actually educating them formally. And ideally, you're creating, at the very least, when that young person leaves your academy, a better person. They're either going to be a better person as a first team footballer, professional footballer for you or for someone else, or they're going to leave the profession of football to do something else, but they're going to do it having gained a lot from us as an organization in terms of the way you treat people, how you set your own personal objectives, the way you live your life, acting with integrity. So, without sounding too worthy about it, our responsibility is far greater in some ways in the academy environment than it is in the first team environment. Very often in the first team environment, we are simply trying to make sure that the people we're bringing in are at least as good as the ones we've got, and hopefully better, and will drive better standards. But in the academy, we've got an ability to help shape a young person's life. And I think that's a huge responsibility that we have.
So not every academy would feel that is one of their priorities. Why does Brighton and Hove Albion say, we want to help shape a complete person instead of, we're just going to create footballers? I love that.
I think first of all, it comes back to our values and what we stand for as an organization. And I think secondly, and it's an important message to the parents, a realism that not every young person is going to come out of that academy as a professional athlete. In fact, the chances are they won't. So if the chances are that they won't come out of that academy as a professional athlete, it's not necessarily because we've failed or they've failed. It's just simply because the talent that was there as potential hasn't necessarily been fulfilled. And that could be down to the young person not having enough talent. It could be that our techniques and our coaching wasn't quite right, or the culture wasn't quite right for that player. But either way, we've got a huge responsibility to make sure that they leave us as a better person than the one they came in, or a more refined person, or a more rounded person. And that's something which, if they're going to pursue a career as a professional athlete, that should stand them in good stead. If they're going to move into another walk of life, that's also going to stand them in good stead. So I think we see that as a big part of our responsibility, and a big part of why a parent would choose our academy over another club's.
Identifying great talent, I find, is harder than identifying world-class talent. So most of us would probably agree who the top 5 strikers are in the world, although we might order them differently in ranking. So if you have 30 million pounds for a striker, we know where we're going. If you have 2 million pounds for a striker, there's a whole lot more nuance. We're not all going to agree on who the best is. Yeah. We're also not all going to agree on the valuation. You guys have had a tremendous track record of finding people perhaps undervalued or unrecognized by the market and turning them into highly valuable assets. What's the formula?
If I told you that, then we wouldn't have that edge that we've got. I mean, I think, we're fortunate that we've got access to world-class data that has been gathered and built and refined over many, many, many years. And like all data in any industry, the more you have of it and the better you interpret it, the more chance you've got of making proper use of it. And, we've got a lot of it. We've spent a long time interpreting it and dissecting it. And therefore, in more recent times, we've been more successful in using it to our significant advantage on the pitch and then future business from it. But it's not a perfect science because we're still dealing with human beings. So you may have an outstanding athlete that ticks every box in terms of attributes from a technical point of view or a tactical point of view or an athletic point of view. But they may be a flawed character. What do? Do you take the risk and use the data you've got to say, this is the next Lionel Messi. We need this guy. Or do you say, wow, the character could destroy our locker room and undermine the values of our club, dilute the culture that we've established? They're the more difficult decisions. And, very often we will try and get as much information on this cultural piece, this character piece as we can in order to actually mitigate the worries that we might have or to eliminate them altogether. Sometimes that's not possible. And then it becomes a judgment for the owner, for the technical director, for the coach. Are we prepared to take this outstanding talent and forego the cultural side of the jigsaw? And very often the answer to that is no. The culture's far more important sometimes to be maintained for the overall good and health of the club going forward than one outstanding talent. Because if we're doing our jobs properly and we're reading the data correctly, there will be another outstanding talent. And we will be able to find that one, hopefully, with a culture and a personality and a character profile that is more complementary to who we are and what we're about. Occasionally, it might be a marginal call. And of course, if it's a marginal call, you're going to take the risk because the generational talent that you might be missing out on, would be just that. But very quickly, going back to hiring anyone, fairly soon whether you've made the right choice or the wrong choice in that situation. And again, like a non-athletic talent, you would still support that player. You would still support that athlete. You would try and help them to become a better person so that you can actually make the most of that incredible athletic talent they've got, but you want the cultural piece to fit as well.
So similar question, but I'm going to go to a manager, a head coach, as we Americans like to say. I would say it's a lot easier to know who the top athletes are than perhaps the best sporting directors or coaches. The best athletes usually at a lot of the best teams.
Yeah.
I don't think that's necessarily the case for the best coaches. The best coach might be second, third division. They might be, I might exaggerate here, they might be a full-time firefighter and coaching youth kids, right?
Yeah.
Like the skill set of coaching is not always reflected in what club somebody plays for. How do you find good coaches who aren't at the top of the budget and the payroll?
The same way we do with the players. We use a lot of data. We are looking at how they're performing, where they're performing, what kind of budgets they have to perform, what kind of budgets they're competing with. So sometimes, a coach's performance, which may look at first glance average because they're mid-table with a small club, when you actually dig beneath that, you realize that their resources might be a fraction of clubs that are below them and above them. So that immediately elevates their performance to a different level. And then you realize maybe that they're making the players they've got even better. So they're actually generating value for the club that they're at, whilst also overperforming against clubs with bigger budgets and better players. And then you realize that actually that's more about them. That's more about their talent, their ability, their personal attributes that are outstanding, but just being hidden slightly because of where they are, where they might be in the league table at that time, in the standings at that time. And actually uncovering that is so exciting. And, we've been fortunate that through our analysis of our data, we've been able to do that with Graham Potter, with Roberto De Zerbi, and now currently with Fabian Hertzler. None of those coaches were household names when they joined us, but they're all household names now. And that's down to them and their abilities and their incredible talent, as much as it is about our ability to find them in the first place.
It takes courage to make that decision too, doesn't it? Because the fans and the media might not recognize the same information because they don't have your data and they don't have your decision tree.
That's right. And that's where Tony Bloom is, in my opinion, at his best, because he will back himself and the data that we use to make those big calls. And Tony will always say, if there's one decision that ultimately rests with him, it's the hiring of the head coach, and the firing of the head coach, if it ever comes to that, because it is really, I suppose, the ultimate trust that the owner's placing in one employee in the football club, almost beyond the chief executive, in that the head coach really is the person that's going to make or break the club in any given season. The players obviously have a massive part. The staff that support the players have a massive part. But the head coach is ultimately, if he's doing his job in the way that we would see it as being appropriately done, picking the team, determining the tactics, making the requests of the sort of players that he needs but hasn't got, or has but doesn't want. The owner's being very, very largely advised by the head coach, and therefore it stands ultimately to reason that the owner would make the final call on the hiring or the firing of the coach. And in our club, that is the way it works. You know, very often it's a decision we take together, and it's my job perhaps to execute the contract one way or the other, in or out. But ultimately, Tony is making that call, and quite rightly so. So
before this job, you were in North America. You were CEO of the Vancouver Whitecaps. What was MLS like?
Fantastic. I loved it. And I still watch MLS. You know, I'm excited for the new season to start imminently. It was a life experience as much as a new career experience.
It's one of the most beautiful places on earth. If you haven't been to Vancouver and Whistler, you're missing out. You really are. It's special. People are really very, very nice people to live and work with. You know, the city itself is spectacular. It was a cultural adjustment. It was harder than I thought. You know, I think, you know, someone said to me not long after I joined the club, after probably 2 or 3 months of holding staff meetings and leading meetings in the club, and one of the Canadians said to me, "Paul, you know, we speak the same language, but we don't really." And what I took from that is that I needed to think a little bit differently and communicate in a slightly different way in order to make my largely Canadian North American workforce fully understand what I was asking for. And, you know, I think sometimes I was naive enough to make the mistake of, we speak the same language, it's English. Culturally, we're quite similar. You know, probably the difference between Brits and Americans is sort of maybe that much, but Canadians sit in the middle. So the adjustment will be actually quite easy. But it was tougher than I thought. And it took quite a while to make sure that what I was saying and what people were doing as a result were exactly aligned. That in itself was a great challenge. From a family point of view, you know, my kids had a wonderful time. Initially, it was tough. They didn't want to go. They didn't want to leave the UK, but then they didn't want to leave Vancouver when it was time to come back to the UK. So they made that adjustment. And I think all three of them benefited hugely from the experience of being different, having a different accent when most of the kids in their class had the same accent, standing out for liking this and not that, or that sport was more important over that sport. So just being in an environment where they had to almost be the odd ones out, as opposed to just being, you know, in their comfortable environment in London, in the UK, where they had grown up. I think it was great for their future experiences and life as well. MLS has had a meteoric rise over the past decade plus. What do they need to keep doing or do more of to continue gaining popularity and momentum on the world's biggest stages? Yeah, it's a big challenge because of the size of the states, but I still think there's work to be done in connecting the top of the game with the grassroots, you know, creating the pyramid that we have in the UK where you can play football as a kid and you can see a very clear pathway to the top of the game as a professional athlete.
I think in North America, it's still a little bit confusing as to how you navigate that. And
expensive.
Very expensive for parents. Pay-to-play models are prevalent, and some of those pay-to-play models are very, very expensive for kids in poorer areas. The college system is a little bit confusing. Do I need to abandon being a soccer player to get into a good college and suddenly become an American footballer or a hockey player or whatever it happens to be? And then I think the connection of the professional game, MLS having some form, and dare I say it, promotion, relegation within the system in order for smaller aspiring clubs to progress. It's difficult because, Don Garber and his team and all of the owners there have done an amazing job at creating a professional football system that's sustainable, attractive, growing, developing the game. But I still think sometimes the promotion relegation would set it apart from other North American sport, create some jeopardy that I know is almost sort of anathema to American sports franchise owners, but could set it apart from NBA, from NFL, from NHL, in a way that suddenly sees media rights grow exponentially on the back of it, because that jeopardy is one of the things that drives the value in Europe. And, it's not there in MLS, and I think it could be.
So in Vancouver and now at Brighton, you have a track record of clubs outperforming their budget and their market size. How do you do that? How do you sustain success over the years without having the same budgets as the biggest clubs in the biggest cities?
Well, first of all, it's a result of a massive team of people performing at the highest level consistently. It's not just about one person. It's not even just about Tony Bloom. He's a huge part of it, and the biggest part of it, in my opinion, in terms of clear vision and the financial support and bandwidth he's given us to compete. But you need to assemble great teams of people on and off the pitch. You need to give them a very clear vision. You need to establish a behavioral framework, a culture that they can exist and thrive in. And then you need to actually have strategies that align to those vision and values. And then you have to execute relentlessly. And relentlessly means just that. Every single day, doing the things that you need to do to achieve the objectives, to move towards the vision. And there'll be, as there are in all professional sports, tons of outside noises that are going to be designed in some ways to distract you, to detract you, to make you or invite you to change your direction. But you can't do that. Very, very critically, I think, in high-performing organizations, you have to ignore the noise. Not all of it, because some of it might be valuable to tweak strategy, but the vast majority of the noise is just that. And it's going to distract if you allow it to. So we always talk about executing relentlessly, ignoring the noise, focusing on what we've been asked to do. And when we say what we've been asked to do, that means by each other. We're constantly asking each other to do more, to be better, to try and perform at a higher level. And that kind of constant reinforcement and religious execution of our strategy has given us the platform to succeed. It doesn't guarantee anything, because you still need a bit of luck as well. You still need that, I think, in any high-level sport, no matter how high-performing the athletes, no matter how high-performing the teams around those athletes, there's always going to be an element of luck. One referee's decision that goes your way versus one that doesn't, on a given day, can be the difference between winning and losing, even if you've outperformed the opposition on that day. So luck will always play a part, but you can do a lot to drive your own luck, and we try and do that every day.
Paul, how do you know when it's noise and you need to stay focused with your blinders on versus maybe it's wisdom to factor in? Because that's a really important part for a CEO or a senior business leader to know. Vision's right. We're staying regardless of what the results might show versus maybe this is a time to pivot.
I think the one thing that drives so much of the noise in professional sports is emotion. Executives in professional sport can't be emotional. They can't ignore emotion, but they can't be emotional. So for me, when I hear the noise after a game, whether it's good or bad, it's usually emotionally driven. When I take in noise days, weeks after a game, good or bad, it's usually far more rational. And I might tune into it a little bit more, because the emotion by then has usually been taken out or has been in some way sort of neutralized or diluted. And so I try not to worry too much about that immediate 48 hours around a game or a big decision, a decision to buy a player, sell a player, hire a coach, fire a coach, because that initial 48 hours is emotionally driven noise. The further away from the actual moment of truth, if you like, the decision, the result, the game, performance, the noise is probably a little bit more valuable to me. And then it's a question of judgment and discussion and getting other people's opinions, because, my opinion is certainly not always the right one. Very often isn't the right one. So getting as many inputs as I can. Did you read that? Did you hear that? What do you think? What is your view of that? Talking to Tony in my case, did you see that article I sent you? Yeah, what do you think? Yeah, they've got a couple of good points in there, but most of it's just a bit of noise. We shouldn't be worried too much about that. And so using each other's experiences and it's a game of opinions. It's subjective in large parts, isn't it? So, you don't want to kill opinion. You don't want to suppress opinion. But it doesn't necessarily mean that every opinion is right. You have to make those judgments, and, it's a percentages game. You're not going to get every one of those judgments right. You're hoping you're going to get a majority of your judgment of somebody else's opinion right. But it's, there are times you're going to get it wrong. And that's the nature of the business we're in.
One of my friends is a GM of a basketball team, and I got to be part of the postmortem with him after they lost a game. And he was sharing that according to their data, they would have won that game 9 out of 10 times. It's like, some of this is chance. And if all of our shooters shot their normal percentage in these cases, we would have won by 15. So in their case, they didn't believe there was anything to pivot on for the next game, because chance would end up being in their favor.
Yeah.
And it's not always what happens on the pitch. The final result isn't always the perfect indicator of whether the process was right and the supply chain was built correctly.
That's right. And there are many times in top level sport where the result will be an outlier of the performance, either good or bad. You can perform badly and win, and you can play really well and lose. And so we always try and add a degree of objectivity to what is a largely subjective opinion base out there. Just because people have different opinions, again, it doesn't mean to say that their opinions are wrong. They may have just seen the game slightly differently to you. And so we try and use as much objective analysis as we can of a performance, rather than focus so much on the result. We lost heavily a few weeks ago at Nottingham Forest, 7-0, our worst defeat for 70 years in the club's history. But the performance wasn't as bad as the 7-0 suggests. Elements of the performance were, but other elements of the performance were not. And we could easily have been 3-3 at half time. Well, the result at the end of the game would never show that. And of course, the emotion after the game is huge, because fans are disappointed, understandably so. They've spent money to come and watch us, and we haven't performed on the day at the level that they'd hoped or got the result that they'd wished for. And because it was such a big scoreline, of course, that enhances those emotions. And therefore, again, the noise is even greater in the moment. Our focus immediately after that game was, what could we have done differently? What should we do differently next week? How can we ensure next week's performance is better? And most importantly, how can we ensure next week's result is better? And, here we are 3 weeks after that 7-0 loss. We've won our last 3 games in a row. We've beaten Chelsea twice. We won at Southampton at the weekend. We've scored 9 goals and we've conceded 1. The world looks a different place.
Yeah, it's quickly. Not all new players and a new manager and a new system.
Everything's the same. Yeah. Everything's the same. And the world can look very different in sport in 7 days, just as it can in politics. And you always have to kind of remember that reacting in the moment on the back of one bad result isn't necessarily the wisest thing to do.
So one final topic for you before we switch to our closing. We talked a good bit about hiring. What's the best way to leave an organization? Because you've probably had people resign over the years where your respect maybe grew for them, or maybe it stayed the same. I imagine you've also had people resign over the years where respect diminished based off of how they handled it. Give advice there.
Well, I think I've always tried to put myself in the position of someone who has moved several times in their career to build a career. So you'd be pretty hypocritical to be disappointed or too disappointed or even preventative of someone that wants to do the same. So when someone sort of comes to me and says, look, I've got this opportunity, what do you think? Our reaction has always been, go talk to them, see if what they're offering is what you think they're offering, compare what they're offering to what you've got. And if it's better for you, for your family, for your career, then you leave with our blessing. But all we ask is for you to be open and honest with us, give us an opportunity to pitch against that offer. And sometimes when it comes to it, when the offer's made to you and the choice is yours, to try and convince you to stay. But if ultimately it's right for you, it's right for your family, it's right for your career, go with our blessing. And the way we look at that is, one, that's a good way to attract people in the first place, because they feel they're coming into a culture that's going to allow them to progress, whether that's internally or externally. Secondly, every time someone leaves, you get an opportunity to refresh that position with new energy, new ideas, new thinking, a different dynamic. And that's exciting. And that's positive for the organization. You know, when I was at Ogilvy, way back in my career, David Ogilvy always used to say, always try and hire people bigger and better than you. If you do that, the organization will grow naturally. And there's a real lesson in that, you know, because some people sometimes hire people that are not as good as them, or, you know, perhaps will never be as good as them. That protects that person's position to some degree, but it doesn't help the organization. Equally, sometimes it's better for some organizations to try and throw really good money after someone that's perhaps never going to be quite as good as they think they could be. And therefore, all you're doing is actually increasing the organization's cost base and diminishing its growth opportunity. So sometimes letting people go is not a terrible thing. That doesn't mean to say we have open doors where everyone can come and just take our staff whenever they want, or our players whenever they want. You know, we put in place mechanisms to keep our best people, to motivate our best people to stay, but we're not afraid of losing them. You know, we spend a lot of time on succession planning. We spend a lot of time understanding the market, who's out there, who could be better. And then once we have a gap, we spend the best possible time we have to fill it with someone even better. And, you know, it could be that that person actually helps to accelerate the growth of our organization even faster than the person that's just left us.
Yeah, thank you. So 7 questions we ask everybody. We call it the 7 Question Blitz. What sports event have you never been to that you would love to attend? Singapore
Grand Prix.
Got to make it on your list. Why hasn't it happened yet?
Just always falls on a weekend when we've got a big game. But I'd just love to go to a street race under lights, and Grand Prix Formula One is something that I love. So yeah, that's the one.
What 3 people, either historic or alive today, would you love to do a round of golf with?
Well, I don't play golf, so this is a hard one for me.
You can play paddle with them. Doubles paddle.
Doubles paddle. I was lucky enough to meet Bill Clinton once. And I would love to have spent more time with him, because he was one person who just had this incredible charisma. And I just wanted to ask him lots of questions. So if Bill could be my paddle partner, I'd take that.
I like it. 3, what sports memory holds the greatest place in your heart?
For me, probably the 1981 FA Cup final, Tottenham beating Manchester City 3-2 at Wembley. I was a kid, was there with my dad. It was the first time I'd seen us win a cup final at the old Wembley Stadium. Magical.
What's something about you most people wouldn't know?
I was lucky enough to have afternoon tea with Nelson Mandela at his house.
That's an incredible story. We could have a whole podcast on that.
Yeah.
Wow. Any professional pet peeves?
I hate seeing political views on LinkedIn.
That's a good one. That's actually really wise advice for people to listen to and probably play back over and over again. And interestingly, the world's so polarized. People who put political views might actually limit their career opportunities.
Quite possibly.
Significantly. If you weren't in your current role and you could not work in sport, what would you be doing?
Oh, I think I'd want to be the chief executive of British Airways.
Can you find my luggage for me? I've been looking for my luggage. You were telling me beforehand that in 30 plus years, you've never lost your luggage.
Correct.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
And you fly British Airways all the time. So they've been good to you.
I've always been in organizations where British Airways has been the sort of the preferred airline. And now they're one of our partners. They fly our team. I recently came back from Spain, and before that from the US with them. On time, clean plane, great service, luggage where I expected it to be. Flying the flag for our country. So yeah, I think it's a great airline, and yeah, they've been through a tough time, but I think better times are ahead.
You're the first person to ever say you wanted to run an airline, and I like that answer. I mean, you get to bring the world to people and people around the world.
And again, although of course there's planes and buildings, it's essentially a people business, right? You know, you're moving people, you're using people to make that physical movement happen. You're entertaining them on board, you're serving them on board. Everything around the operation is complex and relies on everybody performing at the highest level for it to work. And I find that fascinating.
And now next time I'm in Brighton, where do I need to go to eat?
Oh, it's probably two restaurants. I would say the Coal Shed if you're a meat eater, which is a great steak restaurant. And then I would go to Etch, which is Stephen Edwards, a MasterChef winner. Also one of our partners at the stadium. Fantastic chef, great food, and very hard to get into that restaurant. But let us know and we'll see. I might
have to give you a call then. Paul, so special spending time with you. Thanks for coming to our offices and letting us have this conversation.
Thank you. It's been great.